apologies for my not standing. It's interesting to hear that kind of sweep of history. I don't know if I feel more like Zelig or Forrest Gump. When you're involved in campaigns, it's not just that you were there or leaning into someone else's picture. You do all of it. When I first went to Washington, I was news director of the American Indian Press Association at the very end of 1974, and I would investigate an issue, report on it, write the story, type it, put it, ink a mimeograph machine. You don't even know what a mimeograph machine is, most of you. And then it was monk with stylus and mimeograph machine. That's the next step. And then you just keep churning out these pages until you have a packet of news that by that time would be old, and you send it out, and it would go to native newspapers, and then they would print, and that would be the news for Indian country. That was the way most of Indian country found out what was happening in Washington, D.C. And I very quickly learned that something that I had observed from outside Washington, but didn't really appreciate until I lived and worked in Washington, that we had abdicated our advocacy to everyone else, and there were no native advocates. So that no native person was working on the bill. There was one native person working on Capitol Hill. Out of 435 members of Congress and all of their staff members, only one was a native person. That was Forrest Girard, a Blackfeet Indian, who was working for Senator Henry Jackson, who chaired the Interior and Insular Affairs kind of committee, and who was from Washington State, had been a terminationist, as many members of Congress were at that time. And what that meant was they had supported the severing of the relationship between the federal and tribal governments. And then he was turned into an advocate just by the fact of having a native person working on his staff, understanding native issues and saying, here's how it affects native people. And having this personalized for him turned him from a terminationist to someone who was very interested in doing pro-native things. There was a sort of a step in between where he said, oh, the treaty fishing rights issues, well, let's just end the treaties. And so Forrest, and working with some of us, calculated the cost of doing that. Because it would be a Fifth Amendment taking, so that would be a taking at a lot of money, compounded, with interest compounded daily from the time of taking. So you're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars for one native nation treaty rights. And so he said, oh, we can't do that. So he became a pro, Scoot Jackson, that is, a pro-treaty senator. So it's fascinating what happens when people come into proximity with Native people and how important it is to be in the room. And one of the things that I've been doing is building those rooms. And you're not just opening a door when you do legislation. you're building a door, and when we were developing the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, we started in 1967, and it had, we got the umbrella policy of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which there had been a policy in place for 50 years under the civilization regulations of the Interior Department, which really they banned religious ceremonies, they banned the Sundance and other so-called religious ceremonies, was the terminology. They banned the practices of medicine men, the heathenish and pagan practices. They made it a criminal act for parents to interfere with the progressive education of the children. That means when the children were being taken to boarding school from Indian Territory to Pennsylvania for a while by the Army, to an Army facility where their hair would be cut and where they were beat up for not speaking English fast enough or at all, and where they would be deculturalized and civilized, and where they would just be kept until they were fully adults and farmed out to do labor in and around Pennsylvania, in this part of Pennsylvania as well as western Pennsylvania, and where they were taught how to be good Indian boys and girls. And the person who had charge of the school had ridden with and fought Native people under the command of General Philip Sheridan and Colonel George Armstrong Custer. And he fought, among others, my mother's great-grandfather, Bull Bear, who was a Cheyenne chief and the head of the Dogman Society at a time when the Dogman Society families comprised over half of the Cheyenne Nation. So I'm here because they couldn't kill him. But what they did was what Pratt did after the Red River War, and he specifically wrote about my mother's grandfather watching him do a scout dance, was that he targeted or handpicked, rewarded the youngest children of people he had fought against. So he assessed who the strong families were. Perhaps people he wished he had killed, perhaps people he admired for their military strategy. For whatever reason, those were the children he took. And he took 5 in the family of my mother's great-grandfather, the youngest, including the son, one of his grandsons, who was named Roman Nose, after the very famous, at that time, Cheyenne warrior Roman Nose, who was married to Bull Bear's daughter. So all of these children, young people, went to Carlisle, and a famous artist, relative, who was part of the extended family, Matches, who will figure heavily in an exhibition here very soon, was part of that family. Not an immediate part, but part of the family. And one of them, the youngest daughter, the youngest child and the youngest daughter, Elsie Davis, did not return, washed up. She did not return. She died there. But until that time, my mother's grandfather and grandmother, who were among the first hostage students in 17, sorry, I'm in the wrong century, I often do that, 1878, in that first class of hostage students, they were part of that. He was Cheyenne, she was Pawnee. And they stayed, they were the ideal civilized family. They did everything right. He was a well-known debater. He was the head of the printer boys. They set type. They, when they learned to write, they helped write one of 3 publications, or all 3 publications they had, the Morning Star, which I think he may have named. I don't know that for sure, but that figures heavily in Cheyenne cosmology, Morning Star, as it figures in a lot of the world's great religions. The Indian helper and the red man were the other 2. My son said that for the faith Indians, that it sounds like that's what they need. They just sprinkle a little Indian helper on them, and voila, you have a War Churchill or some person who is an instant Indian. So I can't say the name without smiling and thinking of my son's Indian helper notion. But Thunderbird, Richard Davis, my mother's grandfather, was the head of the printers' boys. He was the sergeant major. When you see these amazing photos done by a photographer named Choate, who followed these students from their entry to their transformation as short hair. You know, they come in as native-looking people, and then they go into uniform with short hair and with a different kind of carriage with military bearing. And you see that transformation. He's captured that in his photos, the early photos. And my mother's grandparents figured heavily in that series of photographs for many years. And Carlisle sold one photo of the 2 of them with their 2 daughters, first 2 of many, many children. They kept selling this as the ideal native civilized family. And it was a top moneymaker. So they really were, they epitomized Pratt's dream. He had tamed the Indian. He had tamed the Cheyennes. He had tamed the Pawnee. In this one family, you see this in their images. They're trussed up. They're bound. They're beautiful native faces in the fashion of the day. Then Elsie dies, and they immediately leave and go home. They had nothing keeping them at Carlisle. And there's a series of letters back and forth with Colonel Pratt, very respectful, greetings, and they're always written about, well, we hear from the Davis family, we hear from this, they've had another child, they've had another child, they've had another child. And unbeknownst to them, they went, what was called in the day, back to the blanket. he never lost the language. She did. He did not. And he was first an interpreter for the Cheyenne delegation at the Indian Congress in Omaha, which is a big deal thing that happened. And then he was later condoled as a chief. He was a Pawnee Bill's rodeo show Indian, they called it. He was a human exhibit at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. In fact, he docked the Cheyennes into it. They weren't going to include the Cheyennes. This was an exhibit of human exhibits showing how low on the totem pole, as it were, the Indians were, and other peoples of the world, pygmies. So they were to have villages, and to live there, and people could come and observe them, how they lived, and how they were before they vanished, totally. So he saw that this was an opportunity for Cheyenne people to make some money. So he insisted that that they let the Cheyennes be one of the human exhibits, and then he got family members, extended family members, to do this, and they made a lot of money. And they were there with Geronimo was there. These are people they knew and kind of palled around with, if you will. So he was an artist who did the artwork for the Cheyenne Sundance by it's a famous anthropologist named Dorsey. And he went to Hollywood and was in all the Tom Mix movies and worked as a wrangler, brought in extras for a movie called Wind River. He got the Arapahoes from Wind River to be the extras. Went to Wyoming, got them, brought them there. So a very interesting person who raised people in California, in Arizona, in Oklahoma, and in different ways. And he really, to think that this is all one person's life is pretty extraordinary. That he was fighting with his father and with the Cheyennes, the Arapahoes, the Kiowas, the Comanches, Apaches, and the Red River War at Palo Duro Canyon, and then to go to Carlisle. What an amazing journey he had everywhere. And it could have been 10 or 20 people. And what an amazing journey she had. And I won't go through each family member, but they all have that kind of experience. Long histories of doing things and evolving and trying to better the people, even though you look back and say, really, they wanted to be human exhibits. Because the other people had to be human exhibits. They wanted to be. That's how much they needed money, for one thing. And those are some of the things they had to do to get money. So, this is a background that I come from, of that kind of history. My mother's mother went to Chilocco Indian School. My mother went to Chilocco Indian School, where she met my father, who had been to UG Indian School, where he had been beat up for not speaking English and for speaking the Muscogee language, and he had no idea why he was being beaten up. He was 9 years old. I asked him, "What were you beaten with?" He's boards. And, "What do you mean boards?" "Well, 1x2s and 2x2s. Well, that's a bat. When you think of that with a 9-year-old boy being hit in the lunchtime for saying, "Let's change on, let's go eat," boy, which is sort of the way you greet someone if you're a Muscogee around food. So he'd be beat up for that, and they, "Okay, you're not supposed to talk in line," but other people were talking in line. So he would say something in his language to someone else who understood it while they were seated, and he'd get beat up for that. So, "Okay, you're not supposed to talk around food, but they're talking around food. Okay, they're speaking English around food. You're just not supposed to speak your language around food." So he went on to be a World War II hero and was the hub of in the famous Thunderbird Indian Division, 45th Infantry Division that went North Africa and Sicily and Anzio and Monte Cassino and on for my father almost lost his legs, and that was the end of his World War II career. But the Army, and then he went back to Chilocco Indian School, where he'd been taken out of, and finished high school. So I guess after World War II, Chilocco was looking better and better. And he finished school, and then the Army recruited him, because what he had done was that he was the hub of a group of they were in Company C, which was Charlie, but they said it was for Chilocco because they were solely Chilocco Indian School boys. And so they had you hear about Indian code talkers, and some had very formal codes, like the Marines developed a code that the Navajos worked on with them, and that's a very formal kind of code. In Company C, what they did while in training, totally on their own, and on the troop ship on the way to North Africa, they made up their own code based on the coordinates of Chilocco and based on phrases or words of all the languages they knew that were spoken there. That Apache and Pueblo and different Pueblo languages, Cheyenne, and of course all the Muscogee languages. And my dad knew more of the languages than most people. And this was a really storied thing. Out of this comes Ernest Childers, who was my mother's classmate. He was the first Native person to be awarded the Medal of Honor. And they were all highly awarded people who came out of Company C. But they had this code that could never have been broken. It was a guy they knew or saw once who looked in a certain way, and the way you say that look in Apache is this way. It would never have been broken. And then you assign that to be the southeast. Or it wasn't as simple as the lake is here and you say lake. It wasn't that simple. It was a very complex thing that they did. So the Army recruited him to be an actual cryptographer, to make up codes and decode messages, which he did. And went to the Presidio in Monterey and learned, for example, in one 11-month period, he learned 3 dialects of Chinese and Korean. It's a lot of stuff to learn. Those are 2 separate languages. Korean is Persian Chinese is Chinese. And so he learned that. And learned the Romance languages with such ease. So knowing all of these languages, being fluent in them, the only one he stutters in is Muscogee. And of course you know why, because he was beat up in the lunch line for speaking. Okay, so this is some of our reality. Some of our reality. I grew up in Oklahoma in the days where you had the signs, no Indians or dogs allowed. And we'd get beat up for being Indian until we learned how to fight really well and beat other people. So it was a fighting existence for a while. And then happily we got to move with Dad to two places. One was Hawaii and the other was Naples, Italy. So I'm Cheyenne and Muscogee and brought up in both traditions and with both sets of ceremonies. By way of Hawaii, of Oahu, and by way of Italy. So, southern Italy, Napolitano. So that's what I feel. When I hear people say, I feel that I'm Indian in my heart, I sort of feel like I'm Italian in my heart. So I understand what they mean. So this is the reality, a reality of one family. And what I said doesn't begin to do justice to any of our family or even my immediate family, but to give you a glimpse into the complexity of our time and who we are, the multi-layered people, and that we're not just one thing, that we're not just one influence, that we're not just one kind of people, that we don't just have one way of being. Now, I'm the beneficiary of my parents who, as long as they lived, my mother passed away in 2003 and my dad in 2007. And for as long as they were married, they would have conversations like this. Why did you just say that? And my mother, for example, would say, well, it's Cheyenne. Dad would say, that's Chilocco Indian School, or that's Haskell Indian School. And, well, you're right, that is. Or, no, it isn't. So they would have these kinds of discussions about the origin of things. How did we get to be the way we are? And they were constantly trying to figure out what had happened to them, how it had happened, and how they could kind of trace back and what they could reclaim. And there were things that they weren't doing anything about or going to, but they were raising children who could. So I can, to this day, I can hear my mother say in my ear, write that up. Meaning, do something about this. Write that up. Be sure you tell them. Which meant, go see any president and make them do something. So that's who they were raising. So it's no accident that I'm doing what I'm doing. And then I have to say, though, that anytime I would do something of the kind that they wanted me to do, they would both kind of look the other way as if, I don't know what we can do about this child. As if they had nothing to do with it. But my brothers and I, and other family members who lived with us, other cousins who lived with us and went with us to different places, had really benefited from that kind of upbringing and that kind of discussion. And part of it took place around food, around the dinner table, and part of it was reflective of my dad's inability to talk around food. He would ask us questions. What do you think about this? What do you think? That way he didn't have to talk. But he would appear to be engaged in conversation. So, you never know in some families, people never know how they got to be the way they are. I know exactly how I got to be the way I am. And I can trace it, sort of, no, that's Cheyenne. This is Muscogee. And that was something, I mean, that's a serious thing. You have to learn this or that. Be careful not to do this. This is night, this is day. This is the way we do this when we're here. This is the way we do this when we're here. Very strict protocols and very careful ways of doing things. So this is our reality. And then what most of America knows about us and what most members of Congress know about us is from the sports world, from sports imagery, from cartoons, from the way we're portrayed in popular culture, from what we're called in popular culture. And public policy isn't made for cartoons. Good public policy is not made for mascots. So, the longer I work in public policy, the easier the answer to the question, don't you have more important things to worry about, comes. And I used to say, well, yeah, there are a lot of important things, and we're getting to this one. We're doing this too. Now I see this as foundational, overarching, undergirding, that if you don't get this right, if you don't rid the world of, at least the sports world, of these images about Native people, even the ones that are supposed to be the good stereotypes. Oh, this one portrays you as being a proud, noble. There's no such thing as a good stereotype. No such thing as a good stereotype. A stereotype is a stereotype, and they're all negative. They all either set up false expectations that no one is ever going to be that perfect, noble person. Not everyone is going to be crazy horse, or sitting bull, or bull bear. Not everyone can attain that. And what's easier to attain? The other stereotype of the drunk in the gutter kind of thing, or the way that particularly the news, the television news series capture us from time to time when this or that producer or anchor person discovers Native America. They'll do Low Before Indian again. And usually they go to Pine Ridge or to Navajo land, and they show drunk Indians and say, oh, this is a terrible thing, sad. We have to do something to help them. And then a lot of people send turkeys and blankets to Pine Ridge and Navajo land. And get the idea that, which reinforces a whole other set of things. Another reason it's really important to do something about these mascots and things is because if we allow that to happen to us, it makes possible negative things happening elsewhere. It makes possible the continuation of poor housing programs and poor health programs, of inadequate health services, all of these things. Why do we get those? They're not a gift. We gave up the country for those. And we gave up the country in perpetuity for those in perpetuity. So when people talk about Native people as getting too much, or, well, you have casinos, aren't you satisfied? Well, not everyone has casinos. Not everyone who has casinos got rich from it. It's only a handful of Native nations who are mega rich from casinos, and no, that's not enough. Because we don't have the things that were promised in those treaties. So until we do, we're not going to be satisfied. And that's the continuing thing. Aren't you happy yet? We do this for you. We've given you this. We've given you reservations. Well, no one gave us anything. And when people complain about the special rights of Native people and take us to court because Indians are super citizens or are trying to be super citizens, or that the rights of Native people do something to interfere with the rights of non-Native people, the Supreme Court always has to say, well, let's look at this, as they did in the treaty fishing rights cases, for example. The Pacific Northwest and the Great Lakes area in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and they continue on. Those cases continue on to today as habitat cases that are trying to increase the resource in talking about fisheries through rehabilitation of the habitat. So in those cases, the Supreme Court, looking at the Bolt decision, in a 70s case, George Bolt was a district court judge who ruled in the landmark treaty fishing rights case that because of the treaties, the Native peoples in the Pacific Northwest could fish in their usual and custom fishing places on and off reservations, and were entitled to 50% of the fishery, of the allowable catch. So, and that case was captioned U.S. v. Washington. So it was the United States versus the state of Washington, because the Washington Fish and Game people were beating up Indians and arresting them and throwing them in jail for fishing, even though they were doing so while holding the treaty that permitted this, and for which they had given up much territory. So one of my friends, Billy Frank Jr., was jailed a minimum of 150 times. You can document 150, and then you just can't count anymore. And he said that was his job, fishing. And he said, I was a fisherman, and I was the go-to-jail guy. And so that was that case. So when the case was decided by Judge Bolt, who was burned in effigy, who was hanged in effigy, who, when he had to have had heart surgery, personally interviewed every person who would be connected with the surgery, so that he had to look them in the eye to figure out, are you one of the people who hate me and who've been burning me in effigy or hanging me? Are you going to kill me while I'm being operated on? I mean, that's what he had to ascertain for himself as a sitting federal judge getting heart surgery. So that case, in that case, the Attorney General for the state of Washington, Slade Gorton, argued that the Indians were super citizens and that these treaties should be done away with. So the Supreme Court had to say in 1979, this case has been before us 5 times this century and we do not want to see it again. And they decided the same way from the early 1900s to then 1979, consistently. And here it is again. This is the last time. Indians aren't super citizens. They have different rights. Their rights don't interfere with the constitutional rights of non-Indians. They're simply different. Okay, now what is that difference? The difference is no one brought any land with them when they came here. Now that's a shock to some people. They think they brought some land from someplace and that that's what they lived on. And that they somehow gave some of that land to the Indians. So this is how little people know about what happened. Even here, where you have the legacy of the Lenape peoples and William Penn, and the Penn colony, making the treaty of love. And they say this, of love and peace and friendship, and pledging those things forever to each other. And meaning it. And it's a place where you can go to. And it's not the same tree. It's now a grandson of that tree. It was because the original tree was struck by lightning, and then the son of elm, the great elm that's in the Benjamin West portraits, and everyone who has painted this, the tree gets bigger and bigger and bigger. That one was struck by lightning, son of elm, so you have grandson of elm that really is there. You can touch that, and that tree touched its predecessors. And that's how close we are. That's how close we are to this history, is that it's right here. Even though there are few native peoples in Pennsylvania as native nations, there are still some native peoples in Pennsylvania, and you still have people who sort of never left Carlisle, and they're here. There's a sizable native population, and in part they're invisible. So of course the racism against us, them, us, is invisible. So one of my good friends, and one of the people I picked as a co-plaintiff in our lawsuit, Harjo versus Pro Football Inc., which was 17 years, by the way. So if you're ever asked to be a plaintiff in a lawsuit, think of that. That's a long time to sustain an attitude, if you will, and to withstand people going through your garbage and private eyes investigating and all sorts of things that happen, and death threats and all of those kinds of things that get stirred up every so often by almost anything. Mateo Romero was someone I picked. He's a Coche de Pueblo painter, And he's someone I picked because he was young and because he was an artist. And I wanted that sensibility among us. And what he said when we first filed the lawsuit in 1992 against the Washington franchise owners was, you've got to clear the underbrush of stereotypes before our images and ourselves can shine through. And that's so accurate that if you have all of this underbrush, this debris of stereotypes, people think that's us. They don't know what we look like, they don't know what we sound like, they don't know that we are complex or nuanced or more than one-dimensional or two-dimensional. They don't know this about us. So we have to assert that. And I think he's exactly right. We have to get rid of all of these stereotypes in order to fully assert that. So that's what we're doing. We're clearing away the debris. We're clearing away the underbrush of stereotypes. And it may not help us so much, but we're trying to lift that burden from our children. Well, what happened was we won on the merits. We filed in 92, we won in 1999, and then we spent the next 10 years defending that decision, defending the three-judge panel of the Trademark Trial and Appeal Board, defending their 145-page decision that was unanimous. And so when on appeal at the federal district court level, one of the, I was warned that there would be a shift here in the audience, so I'm not taking it personally, although. We had to, at the appellate level, it was appealed first to the federal district court, and then the appeals court, and then Supreme Court. That's how it went. And then eventually we were denied Supreme Court review, so that was the end of our case in 2009. And we did not lose on the merits, though. We lost on a technicality called latches, and that the way that the judge got to make it up was unique in our case. And they interpreted latches to mean the passage of time between the time each of us turned 18 and the time we filed the lawsuit. So in 2005, when I saw that this was going to be probably the escape hatch for them, the loophole with which they could get around deciding against us on the merits or for us on the merits. I organized a new lawsuit of young Native people, just the identical lawsuit to ours, same forum, same cause of action, same patent and trademark board, same trademark trial and appeal board. The only difference is that the young ages 18 to 24. So virtually no time has elapsed after they turned 18 and filed. And that's the case that's going on now. They filed in 2006. Their case was held in abeyance pending the outcome of ours. And once ours was decided, theirs would go through. So theirs is now going through the system. And they have had their hearing in the Black Horse et al. Versus Pro Football Inc. case. And Black Horse is Amanda Black Horse, who's a social worker, Navajo, was working in Phoenix and is now working back in her country, in Navajo land, and counseling whole families in the way that they're developing the Navajo social group. And she's an extraordinary person. And also mother of 2 children, and someone who's just very clear about this issue, about who she is, and so are all the people who are involved in the lawsuit. And I really applaud them for sticking with it, because I know how difficult it was. So they're the ones we kind of get. Our idea had been, when we first filed the lawsuit, Vine Gloria said, we're doing this in order not to pass it along to our children. So what do the courts do? They tell us, you have to pass it along to your children. So we were trying to do the native thing, which is as the elders or the responsible adult population, that we would take it on. And the courts were saying, no, you've let too much time pass. Give it to your children. So that's what we did. And in the meantime, lots of, 6 new requests for new trademark protection have stacked up. And those were held in banks until the end of our case. And so we have 6 letters of protest under my name, and almost the same group of people who filed the original lawsuit with me are taking on the new matters where laches doesn't matter, because you're not dealing with existing trademarks. I'm sorry to get into the tall weeds on this, but so we have the Black Horse case that's identical to the cancellation of trademarks that our case was, and then we have the new cases that will probably 6 new ones that will be consolidated, and so that's frozen in time, pending the outcome of the Black Horse case. We're hoping that the 3-judge panel will decide for the Black Horse plaintiffs as they decide, a similar panel decided for us. And that will be the outcome sometime within a year from the hearing, which they had in March. So that's the status of those lawsuits right now. So what does all this mean? And we have legislation that was introduced earlier this year that would do exactly what we're trying to do through litigation, but do it through a bill in the House. It's an active bill in the House that's introduced by some of the civil rights leaders. John Lewis, who's sort of the undisputed civil rights leader in the House of Representatives, Eleanor Holmes Norton, the delegate from Washington, D.C., another one who comes out of that same era and the SNCC and civil rights leadership experience, and is a lawyer. She's another one of the co-sponsors, both co-chairs of the Native American Caucus, Betty McCollum of the Minneapolis area,